The amber glow of the late afternoon sun stretched across the master bedroom of the Webb residence in Charlotte, North Carolina, casting warm shadows over the carefully laid-out garments on the king-sized bed. Dr. Marcus Webb stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of his navy blazer with the practiced precision of a man who had spent 3 decades in operating rooms where every detail mattered. His salt and pepper hair was trimmed perfectly. His brown eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every credential hanging on his office wall. And his hands, steady hands that had saved countless lives, now folded a pocket square with deliberate care. 25 years of marriage to Elaine had taught him that their anniversary trips were sacred, that they represented more than just a break from the demanding schedules of a cardiovascular surgeon and a renowned architect. They were proof that 2 people who had grown up in the segregated South during the 1960s could build a life that exceeded every limitation that society had tried to impose upon them. Marcus glanced at the framed photograph on the dresser, a black and white image from their wedding day at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Elaine wore her grandmother's pearl necklace and he wore his father's cufflinks. The same cufflinks he was fastening now as he prepared for this anniversary celebration. His father had been a Pullman porter who worked the railways, enduring indignities with grace so his son could attend Morehouse College. And Marcus never forgot the sacrifices made so he could stand in this bedroom, in this beautiful home, preparing for a trip to a luxury hotel without having to check whether they would be welcomed. Elaine emerged from the walk-in closet wearing an elegant cream-colored dress that complemented her warm brown skin, her natural hair styled in graceful locks that fell past her shoulders, silver earrings catching the light as she moved. She had just completed the designs for the new pediatric wing at Matthews General Hospital, and the project had consumed her for months, demanding late nights and endless revisions. But she had insisted they keep this anniversary trip sacred. "Are you thinking about your father again?" she asked softly, recognizing the contemplative expression on Marcus's face, the way his fingers lingered on those gold cufflinks. He nodded, pulling her close, breathing in the subtle scent of her perfume, something floral and sophisticated that she had worn since their courtship days at Howard University, where they had met in the library during a rainstorm. "I was thinking about how proud he would be," Marcus said, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came after long surgeries and longer days. "We've come so far, Elaine. Sometimes I still can't believe we built all this." She smiled, placing her hand over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm. "We built it together, baby. Brick by brick, degree by degree, patient by patient, blueprint by blueprint. And we're going to celebrate it properly at the Grandview Hotel, just like we planned." Their son James had recommended the coastal resort, having stayed there during a legal conference, praising its elegance and ocean views, and the online reviews promised luxury and impeccable service. Marcus had made the reservation 2 months earlier, selecting their anniversary dates with care, requesting the ocean view suite, providing his credit card information and receiving a confirmation email that he had printed and tucked into his leather portfolio. The drive from Charlotte to the coast took nearly 4 hours, and they filled the time with memories, laughing about their early years when Marcus was a resident surviving on hospital cafeteria coffee and vending machine sandwiches, while Elaine worked at a small architectural firm, designing strip malls and dreaming of museums. They talked about James, now a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, carrying forward the work of justice that their grandparents had fought for during the movement. And they talked about their daughter Sarah, teaching literature at Duke University, inspiring young minds with the words of Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou. The interstate stretched before them, passing through small towns with Baptist churches and barbecue restaurants, the landscape transitioning from Piedmont hills to coastal plains, pine trees giving way to live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Marcus had downloaded a playlist of their favorite songs, Motown classics and contemporary gospel, and Elaine sang softly to Aretha Franklin while watching the countryside roll past. They stopped once at a rest area, sharing sweet tea and honey buns from a vending machine, and Marcus took a photograph of Elaine standing beside a historical marker about the Underground Railroad, her face serious as she read about the courage of those who had risked everything for freedom. "We stand on their shoulders," she said quietly, and Marcus squeezed her hand, understanding that every milestone they achieved was built upon the foundation of countless unknown heroes who had demanded dignity when the world offered only chains. The Grandview Hotel rose before them like a palace from another era, all white columns and manicured gardens, with a circular driveway where luxury vehicles gleamed under the careful attention of valets in crisp uniforms. The building itself was a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, something Elaine immediately appreciated with her trained eye, noting the Corinthian columns and the symmetry of the facade, the way the afternoon light played across the limestone exterior. A massive fountain dominated the entrance, water cascading over bronze sculptures of dolphins and sea creatures, and perfectly trimmed hedges lined the walkways leading to the grand entrance with its polished brass doors. Marcus pulled their Mercedes into the valet area, and a young man in a burgundy vest approached with a professional smile, opening Elaine's door and offering his hand to help her out. "Welcome to the Grandview Hotel," he said warmly, and Marcus felt the tension he hadn't realized he was carrying begin to ease from his shoulders. They had arrived. They were here to celebrate 25 years of love and partnership, and the hotel looked every bit as magnificent as James had promised. The valet took their keys and luggage claim tickets, and Marcus offered Elaine his arm as they walked through those brass doors into the lobby that took their breath away with its sheer opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, painted in soft cream and gold, their light reflecting off marble floors polished to a mirror shine. The lobby stretched out before them like a cathedral to luxury, with ornate columns supporting arched doorways that led to various wings of the hotel, and in the center stood a massive arrangement of fresh flowers, roses and lilies and orchids, in a Chinese porcelain vase that must have cost thousands of dollars. Plush velvet sofas in deep burgundy and navy were arranged in intimate seating areas, where guests sat reading newspapers or sipping cocktails delivered by attentive servers, and the air carried the subtle fragrance of expensive perfume and fresh flowers mixed with the faint scent of lemon polish. To the right, Marcus could see the entrance to what appeared to be a fine dining restaurant, white tablecloths visible through French doors, and to the left, a bar area where a pianist played something classical and melancholy. Elaine's eyes were wide with delight, taking in every architectural detail, mentally cataloging the crown molding and the way natural light filtered through tall windows draped in silk curtains. "This is beautiful," she whispered, squeezing Marcus's arm, and he felt a surge of pride that he could give her this experience, this moment of pure luxury and celebration. They crossed the lobby toward the reception desk, their footsteps echoing softly on the marble, passing other guests who barely glanced up from their conversations and cocktails. The reception desk was a long curve of polished mahogany, backed by a wall of pigeonholes for room keys and messages, all very traditional and elegant in an old-world style that suggested the hotel had been catering to the wealthy for generations. Behind the desk stood a young man in his early 30s, his blonde hair styled with too much product, wearing a navy blazer with the hotel's gold crest embroidered on the breast pocket. His name tag identified him as Derek Hastings, front desk manager, and he was speaking with an elderly white couple, laughing at something the man had said, his manner warm and accommodating as he handed over key cards and gestured toward the elevators. Marcus and Elaine approached the desk with the easy confidence of people accustomed to professional environments, people who had navigated boardrooms and hospital administrations and architectural review committees. "Good evening," Marcus said pleasantly as the elderly couple departed with their luggage cart. We have a reservation under Webb, Marcus and Elaine Webb, checking in for 3 nights in the Ocean View suite. He placed his portfolio on the counter and withdrew the printed confirmation email, sliding it across the polished surface toward Derek. The desk clerk's eyes flicked from the paper to Marcus, then to Elaine, and something subtle shifted in his expression, a tightening around his mouth, a coolness entering his gaze that hadn't been there moments before when he was joking with the white guests. Derek picked up the confirmation with 2 fingers as if it might be contaminated, scanning it with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read, but that made his physician's instinct for reading people begin to sound quiet alarms. "Webb," Derek said slowly, typing into his computer system with deliberate keystrokes. "Let me just check our availability." The phrase hung in the air like smoke, and Elaine's hand tightened imperceptibly on Marcus's arm. "We have a confirmation number," Marcus said, keeping his voice level and professional, pointing to the reference number highlighted on the printed page. "The reservation was made 2 months ago, confirmation received immediately, and we received a reminder email last week confirming our check-in for today." Derek continued typing, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern that felt rehearsed, theatrical. "Yes, I see something here in the system, but it appears there's been an error, a double booking situation. Our reservation system has been experiencing some technical difficulties lately." Marcus felt the familiar weight settling into his chest, the weight he had carried since childhood growing up in Birmingham, the weight his father had warned him about, the weight that came from knowing that no matter how many degrees you earned or how much money you made, there would always be places where your skin color mattered more than your credentials. He glanced at Elaine and saw his own recognition reflected in her eyes, that terrible understanding that they were not being seen as Dr. Marcus Webb and Elaine Webb, award-winning architect, but simply as black people who didn't belong in this pristine white lobby. "I don't understand," Elaine said, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone trying to remain calm while anger built like pressure in a sealed vessel. "Our credit card was charged a deposit 2 months ago. We have written confirmation. How can there be a double booking?" Derek looked up from his computer screen with an expression of manufactured sympathy that made Marcus want to demand to speak to the owner immediately, but years of navigating predominantly white professional spaces had taught him the value of patience and documentation. "These things happen with automated systems," Derek said smoothly. "Unfortunately, we're completely booked for the weekend. A wedding party has reserved most of our premium rooms. I'm afraid I don't have any availability at all. Certainly not the Ocean View suite you requested." Behind them, Marcus heard the brass doors open and the sound of new guests entering, heard Derek's attention shift momentarily to assess these arrivals. And when Marcus turned slightly, he saw a young white couple with 2 children, casual in their yacht club attire, the kind of people who summered at places like this. "Perhaps you could try the Seaside Inn, about 15 miles down the coast," Derek suggested, already looking past Marcus and Elaine toward the new arrivals. "They cater to a more, shall we say, budget-conscious clientele." The words hung between them like a slap, the implication clear, the dismissal complete. Marcus felt Elaine trembling beside him, felt his own heart rate accelerating in a way that had nothing to do with cardiovascular exertion and everything to do with the ancient rage of being treated as less than human. He thought about his father's stories of being denied service at restaurants, of being forced to enter through back doors, of swallowing pride and anger to keep his job and feed his family. He thought about the years of medical school, the residency, where he had worked twice as hard to be considered half as good, the patients who had requested white doctors, the colleagues who had questioned whether affirmative action rather than merit had earned his position. He thought about Elaine's own struggles, the architectural competitions she had won but not been selected for because the review committees claimed her designs weren't what they were looking for, the code for saying she wasn't what they wanted. 25 years of marriage, of building a life together, of proving themselves over and over again. And here they stood in a hotel lobby, being told there was no room for them, despite their confirmed reservation and prepaid deposit. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, to demand justice, to insist on speaking with management, but Elaine's hand on his arm stopped him. She shook her head slightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and he understood what she was saying without words, that this battle couldn't be won here, not now, not like this. Fighting would make them the angry black couple causing a scene, would give Derek justification for calling security, would transform their dignity into a spectacle. "Let's go," Elaine said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of generations who had been forced to leave through back doors and drink from separate fountains and sit in balconies while white people enjoyed orchestra seats. Marcus carefully picked up his portfolio, folded the confirmation email with hands that wanted to shake but remained steady through sheer force of will, and offered Elaine his arm. They turned from the reception desk with their heads high, their backs straight, walking across that marble lobby, while Derek immediately greeted the white family with warmth and enthusiasm, his voice carrying across the space. "Welcome to the Grandview Hotel. Let me get you checked in right away. And I see you have the children with you. We have a wonderful kids' activity program." The contrast was deliberate, cruel, a performance designed to reinforce the message that some people belonged and others did not. Marcus and Elaine walked through those brass doors back into the late afternoon sunshine that suddenly felt less warm, less welcoming, and Marcus handed the valet ticket to retrieve their car, while Elaine stood beside him in silence, her cream-colored dress and elegant locks and silver earrings marking her as someone who should be celebrating an anniversary in that beautiful hotel, not standing in a parking lot trying not to cry. The valet brought their Mercedes around, and Marcus tipped him generously, despite the anger churning in his gut, because that young man had shown them kindness, and it wasn't his fault that the front desk manager was a bigot. They sat in the car for a long moment, neither speaking, the engine running, but neither of them making a move to drive away. Finally, Elaine's tears came, silent and devastating, streaming down her face while her shoulders shook, and Marcus reached for her hand, holding it tight while his own vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall, because if he started crying he might never stop, might release 53 years of accumulated hurt and rage and exhaustion at having to prove his humanity over and over again to people who would never see him as anything but a threat or an inconvenience or someone who didn't belong in their pristine white spaces. Marcus drove in silence through the coastal town, his jaw clenched so tight that Elaine worried he might crack a tooth, past the pristine shops selling overpriced beach accessories and art galleries featuring seascapes that wealthy tourists would purchase without haggling over price, past restaurants with outdoor seating where white families enjoyed early dinners of fried shrimp and hush puppies, past churches with tall steeples that proclaimed love and fellowship, while their congregations remained largely segregated 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education supposedly integrated American society. The GPS directed them toward the seaside inn that Derek had mentioned with such casual contempt, and when they pulled into the parking lot, Marcus felt his heart sink further, because the building was a tired two-story structure with peeling paint and a neon vacancy sign that flickered intermittently, the kind of place where trucks hauling boat trailers occupied half the spaces and the continental breakfast would feature stale donuts and weak coffee in styrofoam cups. This was what Derek had assumed they could afford, what he believed they deserved, and the insult burned hotter than the humiliation of being turned away from the Grandview Hotel. Elaine stared at the motel without speaking, and Marcus knew she was thinking the same thing he was thinking, that they had worked too hard and come too far to accept this diminishment, to let Derek Hastings' prejudice define their anniversary celebration. "We're not staying here," Marcus said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "We're going to find something decent, and then we're going to figure out what to do about that hotel." Elaine nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue from her purse, repairing her makeup with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago not to let the world see her completely broken. They found a Hampton Inn 20 miles down the coast, a clean chain hotel that offered consistency, if not luxury. And the young black woman at the front desk greeted them with genuine warmth that felt like salve on a wound, checking them in efficiently and upgrading them to a suite without being asked, because she recognized something in their faces that spoke of a hard day and needed kindness. "Y'all have a blessed evening," she said, handing over the key cards, and Elaine thanked her with feeling because small mercies mattered when the world insisted on delivering cruelty. Their room was comfortable and impersonal, decorated in the beige and burgundy color scheme that characterized every Hampton Inn from Maine to California, with a king bed covered in crisp white linens and a sitting area with a small sofa and desk. Marcus stood at the window looking out at the parking lot while Elaine sat on the edge of the bed, and the silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions about what came next, whether they should file a complaint or write a review, or simply try to forget this happened and salvage what remained of their anniversary trip. Finally, Marcus turned from the window and sat beside his wife, taking both her hands in his. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said gently, and Elaine looked at him with eyes that held exhaustion and anger and something else, something that looked like determination crystallizing into purpose. "I'm thinking about my grandmother," Elaine said slowly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "About how she cleaned white people's houses in Atlanta, how she raised their children and cooked their meals and pressed their clothes, and how they treated her like she was invisible except when they needed something. I'm thinking about how she saved every penny so my mother could go to college, how my mother became a teacher and saved every penny so I could go to Howard and become an architect. I'm thinking about every door that was slammed in their faces every time they were told they weren't good enough or smart enough or worthy enough to occupy the same spaces as white people. And I'm thinking that we have resources they never had, Marcus. We have money and connections and the ability to do something about this instead of just swallowing it and moving on." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, felt the anger that had been consuming him transform into something more useful, more strategic. He thought about his own father, about the stories of working the railways and enduring casual racism from passengers who saw him as a servant rather than a human being, about how his father had told him that the best revenge was success, was building a life so meaningful that the bigots became irrelevant. But what if success could be wielded as a tool for justice? What if having resources meant having the power to transform spaces that excluded people into spaces that welcomed everyone? "What are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew, could see the wheels turning in Elaine's mind the way they turned when she was designing a building and solving complex structural problems. She stood and retrieved her phone from her purse, scrolling through contacts until she found their son, James's number. "I'm suggesting we call our son the civil rights attorney and see what our options are," she said. "And I'm suggesting we do some research about who owns the Grandview Hotel and whether they're aware their front desk manager is practicing discrimination that violates federal law." She placed the call on speaker, and James answered on the second ring with the easy affection of a son who talked to his parents regularly. "Hey, Mom. Hey, Dad, how's the anniversary trip? Are you at the fancy hotel?" The question, so innocent and well-meaning, made both Marcus and Elaine's eyes sting with fresh tears, and there was a pause before Marcus cleared his throat and said, "Actually, son, we need to tell you what happened." As they recounted the incident at the Grandview Hotel, describing Derek's manufactured excuses and casual cruelty, James's breathing changed on the other end of the line, became heavier and faster, and when they finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking in the controlled fury of someone who had spent his career fighting these battles in courtrooms. "That's textbook discrimination," James said, his voice tight. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 explicitly prohibits this kind of behavior, and the fact that they had your confirmation and deposit makes it even more egregious. We could sue, absolutely we could sue, but litigation takes years, and the settlement would likely include a non-disclosure agreement that prevents you from talking about what happened. Is that what you want? Marcus and Elaine looked at each other, conducting the silent conversation that married couples develop over decades, communicating volumes with slight facial expressions and the tilt of a head. What we want, Elaine said carefully, is information. Who owns the Grandview Hotel? What's their financial situation? Are there any vulnerabilities that we could leverage? There was a pause on James's end, the sound of him typing on a computer keyboard, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of intrigue mixed with concern. Give me an hour to do some digging. I have access to commercial real estate databases through the firm. But Mom, Dad, what are you thinking here? Because I know that tone in your voices, and it sounds like you're planning something bigger than a lawsuit. Marcus smiled slightly, the first genuine smile since they had left the Grandview Hotel, and Elaine reached for his hand. We're thinking that maybe your grandmother was right when she used to say that living well is the best revenge, Marcus said. We're just exploring what living well might look like in this particular situation. An hour later, James called back with information that made both Marcus and Elaine sit up straighter, their exhaustion forgotten as he detailed what he had discovered through property records and business filings. The Grandview Hotel was owned by a limited liability corporation, controlled by a man named Charles Whitmore, 78 years old, a third-generation hotelier whose family had operated the property since the 1920s, when it had catered exclusively to wealthy white families escaping northern winters. The hotel had been profitable for decades, but recent years had seen declining revenue as newer resorts with modern amenities drew away younger guests, and James had found liens filed against the property by several creditors, including a bank holding a substantial mortgage that was approaching maturity. Here's the interesting part, James said, excitement creeping into his voice. There's a rumor in local business circles that Whitmore is looking to sell but hasn't listed the property publicly because he wants to avoid a bidding war that might drive down the price. He's apparently approaching select buyers privately, trying to find someone who will preserve the hotel's legacy and character. The asking price is around $12 million, which given the property's condition and debt load is probably inflated by at least 20%. Marcus did quick mental calculations, thinking about their investment portfolio that he and Elaine had built over 25 years of careful financial planning, thinking about the commercial real estate holdings they had acquired through their family trust, thinking about the liquidity they could access if they needed to move quickly. We could buy it, Marcus said quietly, and Elaine turned to look at him with eyes that were bright with possibility and something that looked like vindication. We could actually buy the Grandview Hotel. The statement hung in the air like a dare, like a promise, like the answer to a prayer that neither of them had known they were praying. James was silent on the other end of the line, processing what his father had just suggested, and when he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, the voice of an attorney advising clients. You could, theoretically, between your liquid assets and the equity in your properties, you could probably secure financing for an acquisition of that size. But Dad, Mom, this would be a huge undertaking. Running a hotel isn't like practicing medicine or designing buildings. It's a 7-day-a-week operation with staffing issues and maintenance problems and 1,000 details that could go wrong. Are you really prepared to take this on? Marcus looked at Elaine, saw in her face the same determination he felt building in his own chest, the sense that this was bigger than revenge, bigger than proving a point to Derek Hastings, that this was about transformation and justice and creating something meaningful from pain. What if we didn't have to run it ourselves? Elaine asked. What if we could hire experienced management and be involved as owners who set policy and direction? We've both talked about scaling back our practices, about finding ways to give back to the community. What if this hotel could become something more than just a luxury resort? What if it could be a model for inclusive hospitality and community engagement? The conversation continued late into the night, James researching comparable properties and market conditions, while Marcus and Elaine ordered room service burgers and fries that arrived with packets of ketchup and mustard, the kind of unpretentious meal that felt appropriate for plotting a revolution. They talked about their parents and grandparents, about the sacrifices that had enabled them to attend college and professional school, about the weight of being first-generation success stories in families where education and opportunity had been systematically denied. They talked about the responsibility that came with having resources, about how their faith as Christians called them to use their blessings in service of justice, about how Jesus had overturned tables in the temple when confronted with exploitation and corruption. 70% of Americans identified as Christian, according to recent surveys. But Marcus often wondered how many actually lived according to the principles of love and equality that Christ had preached. How many attended church on Sunday morning in segregated congregations and never questioned why their pews looked nothing like the diverse kingdom that the Bible described. "Do you remember that sermon Pastor Williams preached last month?" Elaine asked, referring to their minister at Greater Providence Baptist Church in Charlotte, about how faith without works is dead, how we're called to be doers of the word and not just hearers. I keep thinking about that, about how easy it would be to just walk away from this and tell ourselves we took the high road. But what good does our success do if we don't use it to change the systems that tried to keep us out? Marcus pulled up his banking app on his phone, looking at account balances that represented decades of 80-hour work weeks and deferred gratification, looking at investment statements from their financial advisor at Merrill Lynch that showed a portfolio carefully balanced between stocks and bonds and real estate. They had been saving for retirement, planning to travel and spend time with grandchildren that didn't exist yet. Maybe buy a vacation home in the mountains where Elaine could paint and Marcus could finally read all the books stacked on his nightstand. But retirement could wait. Grandchildren were theoretical, and this opportunity was concrete and immediate and felt like destiny manifesting through discrimination. "I want to do this," Marcus said, and Elaine nodded, reaching across the cheap Hampton Inn desk to take his hand. "I want to walk back into that hotel as the owners," she said. "I want to look Derek Hastings in the eye and show him that his prejudice has consequences, that we're not going to just disappear quietly and let him continue treating people like they're less than human. But more than that, I want to transform that place into something beautiful, something that honors everyone who has ever been turned away from a door they should have been welcomed through." They called James back and told him to start the process, to research Charles Whitmore's contact information and draft a letter of intent, to assemble a team of real estate attorneys and commercial bankers who could move quickly once they had Whitmore's attention. "This is really happening," James said, wonder and concern mixing in his voice. "My parents are about to buy a hotel to prove a point about racism." Marcus laughed, a sound that felt rusty after hours of anger and tears. "We're not buying it to prove a point, son. We're buying it to make a change." Idun. The next 3 days passed in a blur of phone calls and video conferences. Marcus and Elaine holed up in their Hampton Inn suite with laptops and legal documents spread across every surface, ordering takeout Chinese food and pizza from local restaurants while they reviewed property inspections and financial statements. James connected them with a commercial real estate broker named Patricia Chen, who had experience with hospitality acquisitions, a sharp woman in her 50s who listened to their story and immediately understood what they were trying to accomplish. "I've seen discrimination in this industry more times than I can count," Patricia said during their first video call. "Usually it's more subtle than what you experienced, but it's always there, always limiting who feels welcome and who succeeds." If you're serious about making this purchase and transforming the property, I'm absolutely on board to help facilitate." She reached out to Charles Whitmore through intermediary channels, floating the possibility of a cash offer from serious buyers without revealing their identity, and within 24 hours, Whitmore had expressed interest in a meeting. "He's desperate," Patricia reported. "The mortgage comes due in 6 months, and he's already in default on several vendor contracts. He needs this sale, which gives you leverage." They scheduled a meeting at the Grandview Hotel for the following Monday, giving Marcus and Elaine time to secure financing from Bank of America through a combination of their assets and a commercial loan that their excellent credit made easy to obtain. The loan officer, a middle-aged white man named Robert Sullivan, had been initially skeptical when they described wanting to purchase a $12 million hotel, but his skepticism vanished when he reviewed their financial statements and saw a surgeon and architect with spotless credit histories and substantial collateral. On Sunday evening, Marcus and Elaine sat in a seafood restaurant overlooking the ocean, eating boiled shrimp and coleslaw while watching the sun set over the water in brilliant oranges and purples that reminded them why they had chosen this coast for their anniversary trip. "Are you scared?" Elaine asked, peeling a shrimp with practiced efficiency. Marcus considered the question honestly, thinking about the magnitude of what they were about to do, the risks involved in taking on a struggling business in an industry they knew nothing about, the possibility of failure and financial loss. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but I'm more afraid of looking back in 20 years and regretting that we didn't take this chance when we had it. I'm afraid of becoming the kind of people who have resources, but don't use them to make the world better. My father used to say that, to whom much is given, much is required, and I feel like God, or the universe, or whatever you want to call it, has put this opportunity in front of us for a reason." Elaine nodded, squeezing lemon over her shrimp and thinking about her grandmother who had cleaned houses, and her mother who had taught elementary school, and herself who had designed buildings, each generation climbing higher, reaching further, refusing to be limited by the boxes that society tried to force them into. "Tomorrow we walk back through those doors," she said. "Tomorrow we show Derek Hastings and Charles Whitmore and everyone else that we're not the people they assumed we were. Tomorrow, we take the place that rejected us and we transform it into something better." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, paid with a credit card that would soon be used to wire $12 million, and drove back to their Hampton Inn room to prepare for the meeting that would change everything. Monday morning arrived with clear blue skies and temperatures in the mid-70s. The kind of perfect coastal weather that drew tourists to the Grandview Hotel in the first place. And Marcus stood before the bathroom mirror in their Hampton Inn room, adjusting his tie with hands that remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He had chosen his best charcoal suit, the one he wore for medical conferences where he presented research papers, and Elaine emerged from the bedroom wearing a tailored navy dress with pearls, her locks pinned up in an elegant style that showcased the graceful line of her neck. They looked like what they were, successful professionals with the means and credentials to purchase a luxury hotel, and Marcus felt a fierce pride looking at his wife of 25 years, seeing in her face the determination that had carried her through architecture school and difficult projects, and now into this moment of reckoning. "Ready?" he asked, and she nodded, picking up her leather portfolio that contained copies of their financing documents and legal paperwork. "I've been ready since Derek Hastings looked at us like we were dirt on his shoe," she said quietly. They drove to the Grandview Hotel in silence, both processing what was about to happen, both aware that they were crossing a threshold that would fundamentally change their lives, regardless of how the meeting concluded. As they pulled into the circular driveway, Marcus saw the same valet who had parked their car a week ago, saw recognition flash across the young man's face, followed by confusion about why they were returning. And Marcus handed over his keys with a generous tip and a calm smile that gave nothing away. The brass doors opened into the same opulent lobby with its crystal chandeliers and marble floors, but this time Marcus and Elaine walked through that space, accompanied by Patricia Chen and their attorney Michael Rodriguez from James's firm, both carrying briefcases that announced serious business intent, and their presence drew immediate attention from hotel staff who clustered near the reception desk, whispering among themselves. Derek Hastings stood behind that same mahogany counter, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his hotel blazer crisp and pressed, and when his eyes landed on Marcus and Elaine, his expression cycled rapidly through surprise, confusion, and something that looked like the beginning of fear. Patricia walked directly to the desk with the confidence of someone who had negotiated dozens of commercial real estate transactions, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble. "We're here for a 10 o'clock meeting with Mr. Charles Whitmore regarding the potential acquisition of this property," she announced in a voice that carried across the lobby. "Please inform him that the prospective buyers have arrived." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his brain clearly struggling to process the information that the black couple he had turned away last week had returned with lawyers and a real estate broker to potentially purchase the entire hotel. I'll call the manager," he stammered, reaching for the phone with shaking hands, and Marcus felt a dark satisfaction watching the man's composure crumble, watching him realize that his casual racism might have consequences beyond the immediate pleasure of making two people feel unwelcome. Within minutes, a woman in her mid-40s emerged from an office behind the reception area, her black suit and professional demeanor marking her as hotel management, her expression carefully neutral as she approached the group. "I'm Patricia Chen, the general manager," she said, extending her hand first to Patricia the broker and then to Marcus and Elaine and their attorney. And Marcus noted with approval that she made eye contact and seemed genuinely professional rather than performing courtesy while harboring prejudice. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting you in the executive conference room. If you'll follow me, please." They crossed the lobby under Derek's stunned gaze and the curious stares of other staff members, walked down a corridor lined with portraits of the hotel's history, sepia-toned photographs showing the property in the 1920s when it had first opened with segregated facilities that would have barred Marcus and Elaine from entry entirely, when the only black faces in these halls would have been servants and kitchen staff invisible except when needed. The irony was not lost on Marcus that they were about to potentially purchase a building constructed on the profits of discrimination, that they would transform a monument to exclusion into something radically different, and the symbolism felt almost too perfect to be coincidental. The conference room was appointed with the same luxury as the rest of the hotel, a long, polished table surrounded by leather chairs, windows overlooking the manicured gardens and ocean beyond, and at the head of the table sat Charles Whitmore. He was a thin, elderly man with snow-white hair and pale blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a seersucker suit that looked like it had been tailored in a different era, his hands trembling slightly with what might have been age or Parkinson's or simply nervousness about this meeting. Beside him sat his attorney, a younger man with a calculated smile, and both rose as Marcus and Elaine entered with their team. Introductions were made with the formal courtesy of business transactions, everyone shaking hands and exchanging business cards, and Marcus watched Whitmore's face carefully as he realized that the prospective buyers were black, watched for signs of the same prejudice that Derek had displayed so casually. But Whitmore's expression revealed only weariness and perhaps relief, the look of a man who needed this sale regardless of who was buying. And when they all sat down around the conference table, he folded his hands and spoke in a reedy voice that quavered slightly. "Mrs. Chen tells me you're prepared to make a cash offer," he said, looking between Marcus and Elaine. "I'll be frank with you, this hotel has been in my family for 3 generations, and selling it breaks my heart, but I'm 78 years old with no children interested in taking over the business, and the financial realities are such that I can't continue operating at a loss. If you're serious buyers with legitimate financing, I'm prepared to negotiate in good faith." Patricia, the broker, opened her portfolio and slid a letter of intent across the table, a document that outlined an offer of $10.2 million contingent on inspection and due diligence. And Marcus watched Whitmore's attorney scan the terms with a poker face that couldn't quite hide his interest. "This is below your asking price," the attorney said, his tone neutral, but his body language suggesting willingness to discuss. Patricia nodded calmly. "It reflects the property's actual market value given the deferred maintenance issues our preliminary inspection revealed, the outstanding liens we discovered in public records, and the declining revenue trend over the past 5 years. My clients are prepared to close within 30 days with cash, no financing contingencies beyond what's already secured, which, given your mortgage situation, should be extremely attractive." The negotiation dance continued for over an hour. Numbers adjusted and terms refined, but Marcus found his attention drifting to the windows where he could see hotel guests lounging by the pool, families with children eating ice cream, couples strolling through the gardens, and he imagined what this place could become under their ownership. Imagined diversity training for staff and partnerships with historically black colleges to create hospitality internships and community events that would open these doors to people who had never felt welcome in spaces like this. Elaine was taking notes in her architect's hand, already envisioning renovations and improvements, already seeing past the faded grandeur to the potential underneath. And when she caught his eye across the table, she smiled slightly, a private communication that said they were doing the right thing, regardless of the financial risk. Finally, the attorneys hammered out terms that both sides could accept, $11.5 million, with a 45-day closing period to allow for comprehensive inspections and title work. And Whitmore sagged back in his chair with visible relief, looking every one of his 78 years. "There's one condition," Marcus said suddenly, his voice cutting through the self-congratulatory atmosphere as lawyers prepared to draft the agreement, and everyone turned to look at him with varying expressions of concern because last-minute conditions could derail negotiations that seemed complete. "Before we sign anything, I need to tell you why we're buying this hotel." And the room went silent, tension crackling like static electricity, and Marcus looked directly at Charles Whitmore with an intensity honed by years of delivering difficult diagnoses to patients who needed to hear truth. "1 week ago, my wife and I arrived at this hotel for our 25th anniversary with a confirmed reservation and prepaid deposit. Your front desk manager, Derek Hastings, turned us away, claiming there was a system error and no rooms available, despite our documentation proving otherwise. He suggested we try a budget motel 15 miles away that would be more suitable for our, and I quote, budget-conscious needs. We watched him check in, a white family, immediately after refusing us service, making it abundantly clear that his decision was based on the color of our skin, rather than any technical problem with your reservation system. The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Marcus watched the blood drain from Whitmore's face, watched Patricia Chen, the hotel manager, close her eyes in horror, watched the attorneys on both sides tense in preparation for the deal to collapse. "That's appalling," Whitmore said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's absolutely appalling, and I had no knowledge of any such incident. Derek has worked here for 5 years, and I'm so deeply sorry. If you're finding value in this story of dignity, overcoming prejudice, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss powerful stories like this one. Drop a comment below saying justice through grace if this message resonates with you. Your support helps us share more inspiring content." Elaine leaned forward, her voice steady, but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. "We're not telling you this to sabotage the sale, Mr. Whitmore. We're telling you because you deserve to understand what we're buying and why we're buying it. We're purchasing this hotel not for revenge, but for transformation. We intend to turn the Grandview into a model of inclusive hospitality, a place where everyone, regardless of race or background, feels genuinely welcomed. But that transformation starts with accountability, which means Derek Hastings can no longer work here in any capacity. Whitmore nodded slowly, his hands trembling more visibly now. I understand completely and I support that decision unreservedly. If the sale proceeds, personnel decisions will of course be entirely yours, but I want you to know that what happened to you violates everything I believe about hospitality and human decency. My father integrated this hotel in 1965, years before he was legally required to do so, because he believed it was the right thing to do despite losing business from racist patrons who objected. It sickens me to learn that decades later, someone representing this property would treat guests the way you were treated. The revelation added unexpected complexity to the situation, painting Whitmore not as a villain, but as an imperfect human whose failure was one of oversight rather than malice. And Marcus felt his anger shifting into something more nuanced, a recognition that systems of discrimination persist, even when individuals believe they've dismantled them, that good intentions without active vigilance allow prejudice to flourish in shadows. Then we're aligned in our values, if not our execution, Marcus said. And if you're willing to include a provision in the sale agreement that Derek Hastings will be terminated prior to closing, we're prepared to move forward. Whitmore agreed immediately, calling Patricia Chen to his side and instructing her to begin termination proceedings. And within 10 minutes, Derek was summoned to the conference room with no explanation, his confusion evident as he entered and saw the assembled group around the table. Derek, I need you to understand something, Whitmore said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. These are Dr. Marcus Webb and Mrs. Elaine Webb, and you turned them away from this hotel last week based on racist assumptions about who belongs in a place like this. They've just purchased the Grandview Hotel, which means they're now the owners of this property, which means your employment here is terminated effective immediately. The color drained from Derek's face as comprehension dawned, his eyes moving from Whitmore to Marcus and Elaine with an expression that cycled through disbelief, humiliation, and dawning horror at the magnitude of his mistake. I didn't. There was a system error. I wasn't, Derek stammered. But the words died in his throat as he looked at Marcus and Elaine and saw in their faces not anger, but something worse, disappointment and pity, the look of people who recognized that his prejudice had ultimately hurt him more than it had hurt them. There was no system error, Patricia Chen said coldly, having pulled up reservation records on her laptop. I've reviewed the logs and Dr. Webb's reservation was never flagged as problematic, was never double-booked, was perfectly valid. You lied to them because you didn't want them in this hotel, and that lie is costing you your job and potentially exposing this property to a discrimination lawsuit that the new owners would be fully justified in pursuing. Derek's face crumpled, and for a moment Marcus thought he might cry, might break down completely in front of everyone, but instead he straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Marcus and Elaine with something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know that's inadequate and I know you have no reason to accept my apology, but I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. You're right that it was about race, about assumptions I made based on seeing your skin color before seeing you as people. I was raised in a small town where everyone looked like me, and I never questioned the prejudices I absorbed, never examined why I felt threatened by difference. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. What I did was wrong, and I deserve to lose my job over it. The moment hung suspended, everyone in the room recognizing that they were witnessing something rare, a genuine acknowledgement of wrong without deflection or excuse. And Marcus felt something in his chest loosen slightly, felt the tight knot of anger begin to unravel. "I appreciate your honesty," he said finally, "and I hope that losing this job becomes an opportunity for you to do the internal work necessary to change. Racism isn't just about individual bad acts, it's about systems and assumptions and biases that we all carry, whether we acknowledge them or not. You have a choice now about who you become after this." Derek nodded, his eyes glistening, and Patricia Chen escorted him from the conference room to collect his belongings and surrender his hotel keycard, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with the weight of consequences delivered and lessons potentially learned. Whitmore slumped in his chair, looking older than his 78 years, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I failed," he said simply. "I failed to create a culture where discrimination couldn't flourish, failed to properly train and supervise staff, failed to honor my father's legacy of inclusion. I'm grateful that you're taking over because this hotel needs owners who will do better than I did." Elaine reached across the table and touched Whitmore's hand briefly, a gesture of compassion that surprised everyone, including perhaps herself. "We're all imperfect, Mr. Whitmore. The question is what we do when we're confronted with our failures. You could have defended Derek, could have minimized what happened, could have tried to preserve the sale by avoiding uncomfortable truths. Instead, you chose accountability, which matters." Nah. The attorneys returned to finalizing the agreement, and within another hour, all parties had signed the letter of intent that would lead to a formal purchase and sale agreement, had shaken hands and exchanged contact information, had set in motion a transaction that would fundamentally alter not just ownership of a building, but the culture and purpose of an institution. As Marcus and Elaine prepared to leave the conference room, Patricia Chen, the hotel manager, approached them with visible nervousness. "I want you to know that I had no knowledge of what Derek did to you," she said earnestly. "I've been working here for 6 years, and I've always tried to create an inclusive environment, but clearly I failed to recognize the problem right under my nose. If you're willing to keep me on as manager through the transition and beyond, I'm committed to implementing whatever changes you envision for this property. But I'll understand if you want to bring in someone else with fresh perspective." Marcus and Elaine exchanged glances, conducting their silent marital conversation, and Elaine spoke first. "We're going to need experienced management who understands hotel operations, and your willingness to acknowledge failure and commit to change is exactly the attitude we need. Consider yourself retained, at least provisionally, and we'll work together to transform this place into what it should be." The relief flooded Patricia's face, and she shook both their hands with gratitude, already mentally cataloging the changes that would need to be implemented, already envisioning a different kind of Grandview hotel. As they walked back through the lobby toward the brass doors, Marcus saw hotel staff watching them, with expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension, wondering what the change in ownership would mean for their jobs and the property's culture. And he made a mental note that they would need to address the entire staff soon, would need to communicate their vision clearly and give people the opportunity to either embrace the new direction or find employment elsewhere. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of renovation and transformation, Marcus and Elaine dividing their time between Charlotte, where Marcus still performed surgeries 3 days a week, and Elaine completed her hospital wing project, and the coast, where the Grandview Hotel was being reimagined from foundation to rooftop. They had hired a construction management firm called Cornerstone Builders, whose crew worked with remarkable efficiency, updating plumbing and electrical systems that hadn't been touched since the 1980s, refinishing hardwood floors and restoring crown molding, replacing outdated furniture with pieces that honored the hotel's historic character while feeling fresh and welcoming. Elaine's architectural training proved invaluable as she redesigned public spaces to be more open and inviting, removing subtle barriers that had made certain areas feel exclusive rather than accessible. And Marcus worked with Patricia Chen to completely overhaul staff training protocols. They brought in consultants from the Southern Poverty Law Center to develop comprehensive diversity and inclusion programs, requiring every employee from housekeeping to management to complete 40 hours of training that addressed unconscious bias, cultural competency, and the history of discrimination in American hospitality. Some staff members resigned rather than participate, uncomfortable with examining their own prejudices or resistant to change, but most embraced the training with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and several longtime employees privately thanked Marcus and Elaine for creating an environment where difficult conversations could happen. The hotel's reopening was scheduled for late October, time to coincide with Marcus and Elaine's actual 26th anniversary since their 25th had been consumed by the purchase and renovation, and they had planned a gala event that would showcase the transformed property while raising money for a scholarship fund they were establishing. The Grandview Heritage Fund would provide full tuition and housing for students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing degrees in hospitality management at North Carolina A&T State University, one of the nation's historically black colleges, with guaranteed internships at the hotel upon completion of their studies. Marcus had personally endowed the fund with $2 million from their savings, telling Elaine that his father's sacrifice to send him to Morehouse deserved to be honored by helping other young people access education. And Elaine had cried when he showed her the paperwork because she knew how hard her husband had worked for that money and how much it meant that he was giving it away. The local newspaper, the Coastal Chronicle, had run a front-page story about the hotel's transformation under new ownership, carefully detailing the discrimination that had sparked the purchase without sensationalizing it. And the article had been picked up by regional outlets and eventually national media, including a segment on Good Morning America, where Marcus and Elaine sat on a cream-colored couch in the New York studio, explaining their vision for inclusive hospitality. "We didn't buy the Grandview to punish anyone," Elaine had said to the host, her voice steady and her message clear. "We bought it because we had the resources to transform a painful experience into something positive, to create a space where everyone truly feels welcome. That's not revenge, that's redemption." The response had been overwhelming, with emails and letters flooding in from people sharing their own stories of discrimination in hotels and restaurants and stores, thanking Marcus and Elaine for using their platform to address issues that many Americans preferred to ignore. Several other hotel owners had reached out, asking for copies of their training materials, wanting to implement similar programs at their properties. And Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of becoming a spokesman for diversity in an industry he had known nothing about 6 months earlier. James visited frequently from Atlanta, proud of his parents, but also concerned about the toll the project was taking. The long hours and constant travel and financial risk of investing so heavily in an unfamiliar business. "You look tired, Dad," he said one evening, as they walked through the hotel's gardens, where Elaine had commissioned a landscape architect to create walking paths named after civil rights pioneers Rosa Parks Way and Martin Luther King Boulevard and Thurgood Marshall Circle. Marcus nodded, feeling the exhaustion in his bones, but also feeling more alive than he had in years, more purposeful than he had felt performing routine surgeries or attending medical conferences. "I am tired," he admitted, "but it's a good tired, the kind that comes from doing something meaningful. I've spent my whole career fixing hearts inside operating rooms, and this feels like fixing something in the world outside those walls." James squeezed his father's shoulder, understanding on a level deeper than words that some work was worth the cost, even when the cost was high. The night before the grand reopening, Marcus and Elaine stood in the lobby that had been transformed from a monument to old wealth into something that felt both elegant and approachable, with photographs on the walls showing diverse faces and families, with staff in crisp uniforms that included pronoun pins and multilingual name tags, with a mission statement prominently displayed near the reception desk that proclaimed the hotel's commitment to dignity and inclusion for all guests. The crystal chandeliers still hung from the coffered ceilings, but they had been rewired with energy-efficient bulbs, and the marble floors still gleamed. But now they led to accessible ramps and elevators with braille buttons. And everywhere Marcus looked, he saw evidence of intentional choices to make this space welcoming rather than intimidating. "Do you think your grandmother would be proud?" Marcus asked Elaine, as they stood hand in hand, looking at a portrait that the hotel's new artist in residence had created. A painting showing the evolution of American hospitality, from segregated facilities to integrated spaces to truly inclusive environments. Elaine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes glistening with tears that she didn't try to hide. "I think she'd be amazed," she said finally. She cleaned houses her whole life, scrubbing floors in places where she had to use the back entrance. And here we are, owning a hotel where her portrait hangs in the lobby, not as a maid, but as an honored ancestor whose struggles made our success possible. Yes, I think she'd be proud. I think they'd all be proud. The reopening gala began at 7 o'clock on a perfect October evening. The temperature in the low 70s, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of salt water and jasmine, and guests arrived in evening wear to find the hotel transformed into something magical. White lights were strung through the garden trees, a jazz quartet played standards in the lobby, and servers circulated with trays of heavy hors d'oeuvres that included both upscale versions of soul food like shrimp and grits in martini glasses, and traditional coastal cuisine like oysters, Rockefeller, and she crab soup. The crowd was remarkably diverse, including local business leaders and politicians, representatives from civil rights organizations, professors from A&T who would help select scholarship recipients, and dozens of community members who had followed the hotel's transformation with interest and hope. Patricia Chen had outdone herself with the event planning, creating an evening that felt celebratory rather than self-congratulatory, focused on possibility rather than past wrongs, and Marcus watched her work the room with genuine warmth and noticed that she had assembled a staff that reflected the community's diversity in ways the old Grandview never had. Among the guests was Charles Whitmore, looking healthier than he had at the signing 6 months earlier, and he approached Marcus and Elaine with visible emotion. "Thank you for inviting me," he said, his voice thick, "and thank you for honoring this building's potential rather than tearing it down. My father would have loved what you've done here." Elaine hugged him briefly, surprising them both, and Marcus shook his hand with genuine warmth because holding grudges served no purpose when someone had demonstrated willingness to change. The program began at 8 o'clock, with Marcus and Elaine standing on a small stage that had been erected in the lobby, microphone in hand, looking out at faces of all colors and ages and backgrounds, and Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he prepared to speak. "My wife and I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the rebirth of the Grandview Heritage Hotel," he began, his surgeon's steady voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "6 months ago, we walked through these doors as guests with a confirmed reservation, and we were turned away because of the color of our skin. That experience was painful and humiliating, but it was also a gift because it revealed an opportunity to transform pain into purpose, to take a place that had excluded us and remake it into a space that welcomes everyone. We didn't do this alone. We've been supported by an incredible team, including Patricia Chen, who manages this property with skill and heart, by construction workers and designers and consultants who shared our vision, by community members who believed that change was possible. But most importantly, we've been inspired by our ancestors who faced far worse discrimination than we experienced, and who responded with dignity and determination to make America live up to its stated ideals of equality and justice." He paused, looking at Elaine, who stood beside him, radiating grace and strength, and he thought about his father on those railway cars and her grandmother cleaning houses and all the unknown people who had endured and persevered so that he could stand in this lobby as an owner rather than someone being escorted out. Elaine took the microphone, and her voice was clear and strong despite the tears on her cheeks. We're establishing the Grandview Heritage Fund to provide full scholarships for students pursuing hospitality management degrees, because the best way to ensure that discrimination doesn't persist is to develop leaders who are committed to inclusion from the beginning of their careers. We're partnering with local churches and community organizations to provide meeting space and resources, because a hotel should be a community asset rather than just a business. And we're committed to paying every employee a living wage with full benefits, because dignity starts with economic security, and no one should have to work full-time and still struggle to afford housing and health care. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus saw several staff members crying with gratitude, and he realized that they had created something bigger than a hotel. They had created a model for what business could be when it prioritized people over pure profit. The evening continued with tours of the renovated property, including the presidential suite that Marcus and Elaine had originally been denied, which now featured a plaque on the door, dedicating it to the memory of all travelers who had been turned away from accommodations because of their race or religion or identity, transforming that specific room into a symbol of redemption and change. Several guests approached Marcus and Elaine throughout the evening, sharing their own experiences of discrimination, some recent and some decades old, and each conversation reinforced their conviction that this work mattered beyond their personal story. Near the end of the evening, as guests began departing with promises to return as paying customers and spread word about the transformed hotel, Marcus noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance, looking uncertain about whether to approach. Derek Hastings stood in casual clothes rather than a hotel uniform, his hair less carefully styled than it had been 6 months ago, his face showing lines of stress that hadn't been there before. And when he saw Marcus looking at him, he seemed ready to flee, but instead squared his shoulders and walked over. "Dr. Webb, I know I have no right to be here, and I'll leave if you ask me to. But I wanted to thank you in person for what you said in that conference room 6 months ago." His voice was quiet, earnest, lacking the smugness that had characterized his demeanor when he had turned them away. Marcus studied him for a moment, recognizing genuine change in the younger man's eyes, seeing someone who had been broken by consequences and was trying to rebuild himself into something better. "How have you been, Derek?" Marcus asked. And the simple question, asked with genuine interest rather than mockery, seemed to undo something in Derek's composure. "I've been working at the Community Hope Center, helping with their food distribution program and adult literacy classes," Derek said. "It doesn't pay much and it's hard work, but I'm learning about people whose lives look nothing like mine, about struggles I never understood because I never bothered to look beyond my own comfortable bubble. I've been seeing a therapist too, working through the prejudices I absorbed growing up. I'm trying to become someone better than who I was." Marcus extended his hand, and Derek shook it with visible relief, and Elaine joined them carrying plates of food from the buffet. "Have you eaten?" she asked Derek, and when he admitted he hadn't, she handed him a plate piled with food and gestured toward an empty table. They sat together in a scene that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The man who had discriminated against them, and the couple who had purchased the hotel because of that discrimination, eating fried chicken and collard greens and cornbread while talking about redemption and second chances. "What you did was wrong," Marcus said directly, not softening the truth but not weaponizing it either. "But the fact that you're doing the work to change, that you're examining your biases and serving communities different from your own, that matters. We all have the capacity for prejudice, Derek. The question is whether we choose to confront it or let it define us." Derek nodded, setting down his fork because his hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. "I think about that day constantly, about how I looked at you and made assumptions based on nothing but skin color, about how I used my small amount of power to hurt people who had done nothing to deserve it. If I could take it back, I would. But since I can't, I'm trying to make sure I never treat anyone that way again. Your grace in how you handled the situation, firing me but also offering wisdom instead of just anger, it changed something in me. You could have destroyed me, and you chose to challenge me to be better instead." The three of them sat in the transformed lobby, talking until the catering staff began cleaning up, discussing the nature of prejudice and privilege, the difference between intent and impact, the long American struggle toward a more perfect union that remained incomplete. Derek shared that he had started volunteering with the Southern Poverty Law Center's community outreach program, speaking to groups about his experience of holding unconscious bias and the process of unlearning racism, turning his failure into a teaching tool that might help others avoid making similar mistakes. "That takes courage," Elaine said, and she meant it because admitting wrongdoing publicly went against every instinct of self-preservation, required a humility that many people never achieved. As Derek prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at the hotel that had once employed him and that he had used as a stage for discrimination. "This place is beautiful now," he said quietly, "not just the renovations, but what it represents. Thank you for showing me what redemption looks like." After he left, Marcus and Elaine stood together in the empty lobby, exhausted but satisfied, surrounded by evidence of transformation accomplished through resources and determination, and a refusal to let bitterness consume them. "We did it," Elaine said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "We turned the place that rejected us into something meaningful." Marcus kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling gratitude for 26 years of partnership and for this unexpected journey they had taken together. The months that followed brought unexpected developments as the Grandview Heritage Hotel became profitable ahead of projections, booked solid with guests who were drawn by the story of transformation as much as by the elegant accommodations and ocean views. Marcus gradually reduced his surgical schedule to spend more time focused on the hotel and the scholarship program, mentoring the first cohort of Grandview Heritage scholars who brought energy and fresh perspectives to the hospitality industry. Elaine designed a second building on the property, a conference center that could host weddings and corporate events and community gatherings, creating revenue streams that would sustain the scholarship fund in perpetuity. They received invitations to speak at hospitality industry conferences and business schools, sharing their story and their model for using enterprise as a tool for social change. And several other properties implemented similar inclusive training programs after seeing the Grandview's success. The local community embraced the hotel as a gathering place, with church groups holding meetings in the conference rooms and non-profit organizations hosting fundraisers in the ballroom. And Marcus and Elaine realized they had created something beyond a business. They had created an institution that served purposes larger than profit. On their actual 26th anniversary, they stayed in the presidential suite that had been denied to them, standing at the window overlooking the ocean as the sun rose over the Atlantic in brilliant oranges and pinks. And Marcus held Elaine close while thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Your father would be proud," Elaine said softly, reading his thoughts the way she always could after so many years together. "All of them would be proud, everyone who struggled and sacrificed so we could stand here. We didn't just buy a hotel, Marcus. We claimed space that was meant to exclude us, and we transformed it into something that includes everyone. That's not just business, that's justice." Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat, and they stood together watching the new day dawn over water that had witnessed centuries of American history, the good and the terrible, the progress and the backsliding. and they understood that their small contribution to bending the arc toward justice mattered even if the work remained far from complete. The Grandview Heritage Hotel stood as proof that grace could defeat hatred, that success built on values could transform communities, and that two people who refused to accept discrimination as inevitable could create change that rippled far beyond their own lives, inspiring others to use whatever resources and platforms they possessed in service of a more inclusive and equitable world where everyone could walk through the front door and be welcomed home.